Jack's day had been long and arduous. He had just finished a grueling shift at the factory and was driving home through the back roads to avoid the late-night traffic. The sky was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and the only source of light came from his car's headlights, which barely pierced the dense darkness of the rural road. The road itself was notorious for its unsettling atmosphere. It twisted and turned through the countryside, flanked by towering trees whose branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. Jack had always found this road eerie, but it was the quickest route home, and he was eager to get there. As he drove, he remembered the story his coworker had told him earlier that evening. It was a chilling tale about a ghostly bride who haunted this very road. According to the legend, the bride would appear out of nowhere, dressed in a tattered wedding gown, and signal for a ride. If the driver didn't stop, she would somehow end up in the back seat, staring at them through the rearview mirror. Jack had laughed it off at the time, but now, alone on the dark road, the story seemed all too real. Jack shook his head, trying to dispel the unsettling thoughts. "It's just a stupid story," he muttered to himself. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned up the radio to distract himself, but the static-filled music only added to the eerie ambience. He scanned the road ahead, his eyes straining to see beyond the reach of his headlights. Suddenly, he saw her, a pale figure standing by the side of the road, her long white dress billowing in the breeze. Jack's heart skipped a beat. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he slowed the car down. The figure raised her hand, signaling for a ride. For a moment, Jack considered stopping. Maybe she was just a stranded motorist in need of help. But then he remembered the legend. Fear gripped him, and he decided to drive past her. As he passed, he couldn't resist glancing in the rearview mirror. What he saw made his blood run cold. The bride was no longer standing by the roadside. She was sitting in the back seat, her eyes boring into his through the mirror. Her face was obscured by a veil, but he could feel her cold, lifeless gaze. Panic surged through him, and he slammed on the gas, the car lurching forward as he sped down the road. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He glanced back again, but the back seat was empty. The bride had vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. Jack's hands were shaking as he finally reached his home. He stumbled out of the car and rushed inside, slamming the door behind him. He leaned against the door, his mind racing. What had he just seen? Was it real, or had his imagination gotten the best of him? He decided not to tell anyone about the encounter. They would think he was crazy, or worse, they would believe the legend was true. Jack tried to convince himself it was all a figment of his imagination, a trick of the light and his overactive mind. But deep down, he knew the truth. The ghostly bride was real, and she was out there, waiting for her next victim. Tom's night shifts at the local diner were always long and grueling, but they offered a quiet solace he had come to appreciate. Tonight, however, was different. As he locked up and headed to his car, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. The town seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Tom's drive home took him along the same rural road Jack had driven the night before. He had heard the ghostly bride's story countless times from the locals, but like many others, he dismissed it as mere superstition. His rational mind refused to believe in ghosts and legends. Yet, tonight, a sense of unease gnawed at him. The road was enveloped in darkness, with only the car's headlights slicing through the gloom. Tom turned on the radio, hoping to find some music to break the oppressive silence. Instead, he found static. He sighed and turned it off, resigning himself to the quiet. As he drove, he spotted a figure in the distance, a woman in white, standing by the roadside. His heart skipped a beat. She was dressed in a wedding gown, her face obscured by a veil. Tom's first instinct was to stop and help. Maybe she was a bride who had been left stranded. He slowed down and rolled down his window. "Do you need a ride?" he called out. The bride didn't respond, but she raised her hand, signaling for him to stop. Tom hesitated for a moment, the stories he had heard echoing in his mind, but he brushed them aside and decided to help. As he reached for the door handle to let her in, something changed. The air grew colder, and a shiver ran down his spine. He looked back up, but the bride was gone. Puzzled, He turned to look in the rearview mirror, and there she was, sitting in the back seat, staring directly at him with cold, lifeless eyes. Panic surged through Tom. He turned around, but the back seat was empty. His heart pounded as he sped up, desperate to put distance between himself and the apparition. He kept checking the mirror, but she didn't reappear. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, convincing himself it was a trick of the light or his tired mind playing games. Tom reached his home, shaken but unharmed. He parked his car and rushed inside, locking the door behind him. He couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that clung to him. That night, he barely slept, haunted by the image of the ghostly bride in his back seat. The next morning, Tom's car was found abandoned on the side of the road. The doors were wide open and the engine was still running. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of where Tom had gone. The only clue was a few strands of white fabric in the back seat, remnants of a wedding gown. The police were baffled. They searched the surrounding area but found no trace of Tom. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. His disappearance became the latest mystery in a string of unexplained events on that haunted road. Word spread quickly through the town. The legend of the ghostly bride had claimed another victim. Fear gripped the community, and people began avoiding the road at night. The once dismissed stories were now taken seriously, and the locals shared their own eerie encounters, each adding to the chilling legend lore. Detective Samuel Harris stood by the side of the road, staring at the abandoned car, bathed in the soft light of the early morning sun. He had seen many strange cases in his 25 years on the force, but this one felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, an unsettling silence that seemed to hang over the scene like a shroud. Harris was a seasoned detective, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his unwavering dedication to solving even the most perplexing cases. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent unraveling the mysteries of human behavior. His sharp blue eyes missed nothing, and he had a reputation for piecing together the most fragmented of puzzles. As he approached Tom's car, he noted the open doors and the strands of white fabric caught on the back seat. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard the stories about the ghostly bride, but he was a man of logic and reason. Ghosts didn't fit into his worldview. Yet here he was, faced with a case that defied explanation. "Detective Harris," a young officer called out, walking over with a notepad in hand. "We've searched the area, but there's no sign of Tom. It's like he just disappeared." Harris nodded, his mind already racing through possible explanations. "What about the fabric?" he asked, pointing to the strands in the back seat. "We've sent it to the lab for analysis, but it looks like it's from a wedding dress," the officer replied, his voice tinged with unease. Harris sighed. "All right, let's get statements from Tom's friends and family. I want to know everything about his movements last night, and see if you can find any surveillance footage from nearby businesses or homes. Maybe we missed something." The officer nodded and hurried off, leaving Harris alone with his thoughts. He walked around the car, taking in every detail. The engine had still been running when they found it, which suggested that whatever happened quickly. He leaned against the car, staring down the deserted road. It was as if the road itself held the answers, hidden just beneath its cracked surface. Later that day, Harris made his way to the local library. If he was going to solve this case, he needed to understand the legend that had taken hold of the town's collective imagination. He spent hours poring over old newspapers, historical records, and town archives. The librarian, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins, was more than happy to help. "Ah, the ghostly bride," she said, her voice filled with a mix of fear and fascination. "I've heard that story since I was a little girl. It's said that she appears on the road, looking for a ride. Those who ignore her meet a terrible fate." Harris listened intently as Mrs. Jenkins recounted the legend. "Do you know where it all started?" he asked. She nodded, leading him to a dusty section of the archives. It all began with the Collins family. They were one of the wealthiest families in town, but their story ended in tragedy. Harris scanned the old newspaper clippings and found what he was looking for. The youngest daughter of the Collins family, Emily, had been set to marry her beloved fiancé in a grand ceremony. But on the day of the wedding, disaster struck. Emily's fiancé was found dead under mysterious circumstances, and Emily disappeared. Some believed she drowned herself in the nearby river out of grief, while others whispered of a more sinister end. As Harris delved deeper, he found a photograph of Emily in her wedding dress, a hauntingly beautiful image that seemed to capture the essence of the legend. He also found records of similar disappearances over the years, each one tied to a sighting of the ghostly bride. The pattern was unmistakable. Armed with this new information, Harris returned to the station. He called a meeting with his team, sharing his findings and outlining a plan to investigate further. "We need to understand the history of this place," he said. "There's something here, something that's been haunting this town for decades. If we're going to find Tom, we need to get to the bottom of it." His team nodded, their faces serious. They knew the stakes were high. The legend of the ghostly bride had taken root in the town's psyche, and now it was up to them to uncover the truth. Harris felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just solving a case. He was unraveling a mystery that had haunted the town for generations. Jenny's hands trembled with excitement as she drove down the dark, winding road. She had been waiting for this moment for weeks. As a journalist for the local paper, she had written countless stories about the ghostly bride and the recent disappearances, but she wanted more than second-hand accounts, see? She wanted to experience it for herself, to capture definitive proof of the supernatural. Jenny was in her early 30s, a determined and intrepid reporter known for her tenacity. She had a reputation for digging deep into stories, never satisfied with surface details. Her colleagues often joked that she would chase a ghost if it meant getting a good story. And tonight, that joke was becoming a reality. The car's headlights cut through the dense darkness, illuminating the narrow road flanked by ancient, towering trees. The air was thick with tension, and an eerie silence hung over the area. Jenny checked her camera, ensuring it was ready to capture any supernatural phenomenon. She also had a voice recorder and a notepad on the passenger seat, tools of her trade that made her feel prepared and in control. As she rounded a bend, she saw a figure in white standing by the side of the road. The ghostly bride. Jenny's heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She slowed the car, trying to get a better look. The bride was standing perfectly still, her hand outstretched, signaling for a ride. Jenny stopped the car a few feet away and quickly turned on her camera. She pointed it towards the bride and pressed record. "This is Jenny Martinez, reporting live from the infamous haunted road. I've just encountered the ghostly bride. This is incredible." She focused the camera on the bride, zooming in on her tattered wedding gown and the veil that obscured her face. The bride's hand remained outstretched, her movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. Jenny took a deep breath and decided to take it a step further. She opened the car door and stepped out, keeping the camera trained on the spectral figure. "Excuse me, do you need help?" Jenny called out, her voice trembling slightly. The bride didn't respond. Instead, she began to move towards Jenny, her steps slow and deliberate. Jenny's heart raced, but she stood her ground, determined to get her story. As the bride came closer, Jenny felt a chill in the air. The temperature seemed to drop, and she could see her breath misting in the cold night. The bride stopped a few feet away and lifted her veil. Jenny gasped. The face beneath was pale and sorrowful, with eyes that seemed to pierce through her soul. Suddenly, the bride vanished. Jenny spun around, her camera capturing nothing but empty road. She felt a cold presence behind her and turned to look into her car's back seat. The bride was sitting there, staring directly at her through the rearview mirror. Jenny's fear turned to panic. She fumbled with the car door, desperate to get back inside and drive away. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. She turned back to the bride, who was now mere inches away, her cold, lifeless eyes locking onto Jenny's. "Please, I just want to understand," Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. The bride's expression remained unchanged, and then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The car door opened easily now, and Jenny scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind her. She started the engine and sped away, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced in the rear-view mirror repeatedly, but the bride was nowhere to be seen. When Jenny reached the safety of her home, she reviewed the footage. Her hands were still shaking and her breath was uneven. She watched as the bride's figure appeared on the screen, moving towards the camera. But the moment the bride had lifted her veil, the footage became distorted. filled with static and noise. The camera had captured the eerie chill in the air and the sudden drop in temperature, but the bride's face was a blur, obscured by some supernatural interference. Despite the distortion, Jenny knew she had enough. Her encounter with the ghostly bride was real, and the footage, flawed as it was, proved that something otherworldly haunted that road. She wrote her article with a renewed sense of purpose, detailing her experience with meticulous care. The story was published the next day, causing a sensation. People were both terrified and fascinated by Jenny's encounter. The local authorities couldn't ignore the mounting evidence any longer, and Detective Harris found himself with a new ally in his quest for answers. Jenny's article brought the haunted road into the spotlight, drawing attention from paranormal investigators and skeptics alike. For Jenny, it was more than just a story. It was a journey into the unknown, a glimpse into a world beyond the ordinary. And though she had come face to face with the ghostly bride, she knew her investigation was far from over. Detective Samuel Harris felt the weight of the case pressing down on him as he delved deeper into the history of the haunted road and the ghostly bride. The recent disappearance of Tom and the compelling article by Jenny Martinez had heightened the sense of urgency. Harris knew that to solve this case, he had to understand the past. His research led him to the old, abandoned Collins mansion, a decaying relic of a bygone era, situated on the outskirts of town. The mansion, with its overgrown gardens and crumbling facade, stood as a silent witness to the tragic events that had unfolded within its walls. Harris had read about the Collins family, once the wealthiest in town, but their story ended in sorrow and mystery. The mansion's caretaker, Mr. Wilkins, a frail man in his 70s, greeted Harris at the gate. "You must be here about the old stories," Wilkins said, his voice trembling with age and perhaps a hint of fear. "I don't get many visitors these days." Harris nodded, showing his badge. "I'm here to learn more about the Collins family, particularly Emily. Can you help me?" Wilkins led Harris into the mansion, the grand but decaying interior whispering tales of past grandeur. "Emily was a beautiful soul," Wilkins began. "She was set to marry the love of her life, Richard. It was to be the grandest wedding the town had ever seen." As they walked through the dimly lit halls, Wilkins shared the tragic story. On the day of the wedding, Richard was found dead in the garden. They say he fell, but there were rumors. Some believed he was pushed. Emily was heartbroken. She disappeared that very night, and some say she drowned herself in the river out of grief. Harris listened intently, taking notes. "And what about the hauntings?" Wilkins sighed. "They started not long after Emily's disappearance. People began seeing her on the road, dressed in her wedding gown. Some believe she's searching for Richard, while others think she's seeking revenge for her untimely death." Harris asked to see Emily's old room, hoping to find more clues. The room was untouched, a time capsule of her life. He carefully searched through her belongings, finding old photographs, letters, and a diary. The diary was a treasure trove of information, detailing Emily's deep love for Richard and her descent into despair after his death. The final entries in the diary were particularly haunting. Emily wrote about her grief, her anger, and a growing sense of something dark and oppressive surrounding her. The last entry was chilling. "I can feel it closing in. I am so cold. If anyone finds this, please remember me, remember us." Harris carefully collected the diary and the letters, hoping they would provide further insights. He thanked Mr. Wilkins and left the mansion, feeling the weight of Emily's sorrow and the mystery surrounding her disappearance. Back at the station, Harris pored over the diary and letters. Emily's pain was palpable in her words, and he could sense the depth of her love for Richard. He knew that understanding her story was key to solving the hauntings. He reached out to Jenny Martinez, knowing her article had brought fresh attention to the case. Jenny was eager to help, and together they began to piece together the timeline of events leading up to Emily's disappearance. They discovered inconsistencies in the official reports of Richard's death and Emily's subsequent disappearance, suggesting a possible cover-up. Their investigation led them to an old newspaper article about a scandal involving the Collins family. It mentioned a dispute between Richard and Emily's brother, Thomas Collins, over the family inheritance. The article hinted that Thomas had been opposed to the marriage and had threatened Richard shortly before his death. Harris and Jenny decided to visit Thomas Collins, now a reclusive figure living in a dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Thomas, now in his 80s, was a shadow of the man he once was. He reluctantly agreed to speak with them, his voice filled with bitterness and regret. "I never wanted Emily to marry Richard," Thomas confessed. "He was a charlatan, only after our family's wealth. But I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't push him. I swear it." Thomas's confession added a new layer to the mystery. Harris and Jenny realized that the truth about Richard's death and Emily's disappearance was more complex than they had initially thought. They needed to find definitive proof of what had happened that fateful night. Their investigation led them to an old family lawyer who had handled the Collins estate. The lawyer, now retired, provided them with documents and letters that revealed a dark secret. Richard had discovered evidence of financial fraud within the Collins family business, and his death had silenced him before he could expose it. Emily had likely learned the truth after Richard's death, and her disappearance was a desperate attempt to escape the scandal. This new information shed light on the tragic events and the reason behind Emily's restless spirit. Harris and Jenny returned to the Collins mansion one last time, determined to find the final piece of the puzzle. In the mansion's garden where Richard had died, they found an old, hidden letter buried beneath a stone. The letter was from Richard to Emily, revealing his discovery of the fraud and his plan to confront her brother. With this revelation, Harris felt a sense of closure. He had uncovered the truth behind the ghostly bride's sorrow and the events that had led to her hauntings. He hoped that by understanding and acknowledging Emily's pain, her spirit could finally find peace. The town was abuzz with fear and speculation as news of the ghostly bride continued to spread. Reports of sightings surged, each one eerier than the last. People claimed to see the bride on the haunted road in their rearview mirrors, and even in their homes. The air was thick with tension, and the once quiet town was now a hotbed of supernatural activity. Detective Harris and Jenny Martinez were inundated with new information and leads. The local authorities struggled to keep up with the influx of calls and reports. Panic was setting in, and the media frenzy only fueled the fire. Paranormal investigators and thrill-seekers flocked to the town, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous ghostly bride. Harris called an emergency meeting at the police station to address the escalating situation. The room was filled with officers, town officials, and concerned citizens. "We need to stay calm and collected," Harris said, his voice steady but firm. "We are dealing with something beyond our understanding, but that doesn't mean we can't find a solution." Jenny stood up, sharing her findings and personal experiences. "We've uncovered a lot about Emily Collins and the tragic events that led to her becoming the ghostly bride. We need to use this knowledge to help her find peace." As the meeting concluded, Harris and Jenny decided to visit some of the recent witnesses to gather more information. Their first stop was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, an elderly couple who had reported seeing the bride in their garden. The Thompsons were visibly shaken as they recounted their experience. "We saw her standing by the old oak tree," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice trembling. "She looked so sad, so lost. We tried to approach her, but she vanished before our eyes." Harris took detailed notes while Jenny recorded the interview. "Did she say anything? Did you notice anything unusual?" Harris asked. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, she was just there one moment and gone the next. But the air around her was so cold. It was like stepping into a freezer." From the Thompsons' home, Harris and Jenny moved on to the house of a teenage boy named Sam, who had encountered the bride while walking home from a friend's place. Sam's account was even more chilling. "I was just walking, minding my own business when I saw her," Sam said, his eyes wide with fear. "She was in the middle of the road, just staring at me. I thought I was imagining things, but then she started moving towards me. I ran as fast as I could. When I looked back, she was gone, but I felt like she was still watching me." These encounters painted a picture of a restless spirit, desperately trying to communicate but unable to find peace. Harris and Jenny realized they needed to find a way to directly communicate with Emily's spirit to understand her wishes and possibly help her move on. That night, they returned to the haunted road armed with recording equipment, a thermal camera, and a digital voice recorder. They set up their gear and waited in the stillness, the darkness around them filled with an unsettling silence. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog began to roll in. Harris and Jenny knew the bride was near. They turned on their equipment, hoping to capture any sign of Emily's presence. "Emily?" Harris called out into the night. "We know your story. We want to help you. Please, give us a sign." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the thermal camera picked up a cold spot, an unnatural chill that moved slowly towards them. The digital voice recorder crackled, and a faint, mournful voice could be heard. "Help me," the voice whispered. "Find him. Bring him to me." Jenny's heart raced as she reviewed the recording. "She wants us to find Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how? Richard is long gone." Harris thought for a moment. Maybe she doesn't know that, or maybe she wants something that belonged to him, something that connects them. They decided to return to the Collins mansion, hoping to find an object that could serve as a link between Emily and Richard. The mansion, bathed in moonlight, looked even more haunting at night. They entered Emily's room, carefully searching through her belongings once more. Jenny found an old, ornate locket on the dresser. Inside was a photograph of Emily and Richard, smiling and happy. "This must be it," Jenny said. "This is the connection she needs." They returned to the haunted road, the locket in hand. Harris held it up, calling out to Emily. "Emily, we have something that belonged to Richard. We're here to help you find peace." The temperature dropped again and the fog thickened. The figure of the bride appeared before them, her sorrowful eyes fixed on the locket. Slowly, she reached out, her translucent hand passing through the locket as if trying to grasp it. "Thank you." Her voice echoed through the night. "I can rest now." With that, the bride vanished, the fog lifting and the temperature returning to normally. Harris and Jenny stood in silence, a sense of calm washing over them. They had helped Emily find peace. The next day, the town awoke to a newfound sense of tranquility. The hauntings ceased, and the ghostly bride was no longer seen. People began to breathe easier, grateful for the resolution. Harris and Jenny were hailed as heroes, but they knew their work was not done. There were still questions left unanswered, still mysteries to uncover. Detective Harris knew the time had come for a decisive confrontation with the ghostly bride. The new evidence and their deepened understanding of Emily's tragic past gave him hope that they could finally bring her spirit to rest. Harris and Jenny Martinez prepared meticulously for the night ahead, armed with the locket, Emily's diary, and their resolve. They assembled a small team, including the local historian named Margaret Dawson, who had a wealth of knowledge about the Collins family and the town's history. Margaret brought along a collection of old maps and documents that detailed the layout of the Collins estate and surrounding areas, hoping they might uncover additional clues. As night fell, they drove to the haunted road, setting up their equipment under the pale light of the moon. The air was thick with anticipation, and a cold wind rustled the leaves, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Harris briefed the team one last time. "We're here to help Emily find peace. Stay focused, and remember why we're doing this." They positioned themselves at the spot where Emily was most frequently seen. The thermal cameras and digital recorders were ready, and the locket was placed on a small table in the center of their setup. Harris and Jenny each held copies of Emily's diary, prepared to read passages if necessary to reach out to her spirit. As they waited in the silence, the temperature began to drop, signaling Emily's approach. A thick fog rolled in, and the air grew heavy. Suddenly, the thermal camera detected a cold spot moving towards them. They braced themselves as the ghostly bride materialized before their eyes, her figure more defined and sorrowful than ever. "Emily!" Harris called out, his voice steady but filled with empathy. "We have something that belonged to Richard. We're here to help you find peace." The bride's eyes, filled with a haunting sadness, fixed on the locket. She reached out, her ethereal hand passing through the object. "Richard," her voice echoed, filled with longing and despair. Jenny stepped forward, holding Emily's diary open to the final entries. "Emily, we understand your pain. We know what happened to Richard, and we want to help you. Please, tell us what you need." The bride's figure flickered, as if struggling to maintain her presence. "He was taken from me. I can't rest until I find him." Harris took a deep breath, remembering the hidden letter they had found in the mansion's garden. He read it aloud, hoping to reach Emily. Emily, Richard discovered the truth about the fraud within your family. He loved you deeply and wanted to protect you. This letter proves his love and his intentions. As Harris read, the bride's expression softened. She seemed to listen intently, her form becoming more stable. Margaret stepped forward, showing Emily an old map of the estate with a marked spot near the river. "Emily, this is where Richard was found. We believe his spirit might be there waiting for you." The bride's eyes filled with tears, and she began to move towards the river. The team followed her, the fog parting as she led the way. They reached the spot where Richard had died, a peaceful area by the riverbank. The moonlight illuminated the scene, casting an ethereal glow. "Richard is here, Emily," Harris said gently. "You can be together now." The bride knelt by the river, her translucent hand reaching into the water. A faint, ghostly figure of a man appeared beside her, his features soft and loving. "Richard." The two spirits embraced, their forms merging into a single radiant light. "Thank you," Emily's voice whispered, filled with peace and gratitude. The light grew brighter, enveloping the area, and then slowly faded away, leaving only the quiet riverbank under the moonlight. Harris and the team stood in awe, the weight of the moment settling over them. They had done it. They had helped Emily find peace and reunite with Richard. The haunting was over. The next morning, the news of the successful resolution spread through the town. People were relieved and grateful, and the once feared road became just another stretch of asphalt. The town slowly returned to normal, but the story of the ghostly bride and her tragic love lived on, now a tale of redemption and peace rather than fear. Harris and Jenny reflected on the journey they had undertaken. For Harris, it was a reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding in solving even the most inexplicable cases. For Jenny, it was a testament to the power of perseverance and the impact of uncovering the truth. As they packed up their equipment, Harris turned to Jenny. "You did great out there. This story is going to help a lot of people understand the importance of remembering and honoring the past." Jenny smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "Thank you, Detective. I couldn't have done it without your guidance." As they drove away from the haunted road, the sun rose, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The town had found peace, and so had the ghostly bride. The morning after the final confrontation, the town awoke to a sense of tranquility that had been absent for months. The ghostly bride's story had reached its conclusion, and with it, the fear and uncertainty that had gripped the community began to dissipate. Detective Harris and Jenny Martinez were hailed as heroes, but both knew that the true victory lay in bringing peace to Emily and Richard's restless spirits. Reflections and closure. Detective Samuel Harris sat in his office, a cup of coffee cooling on his desk as he reflected on the case that had consumed his life. The room was filled with files and notes, a testament to the meticulous work he had put into solving the mystery of the ghostly bride. For Harris, the case was more than just another investigation. It was a journey into the unknown that challenged his understanding of reality. Harris had always been a man of logic and reason, grounded in facts and evidence. The supernatural had no place in his worldview, but this case had forced him to reconsider. He thought about the moments of doubt, the eerie encounters, and the final confrontation by the river. It had all been real, and it had left a profound impact on him. He picked up Emily's diary, flipping through the pages filled with her sorrow and longing. Harris felt a deep sense of empathy for her. She had been a victim of tragic circumstances, and helping her find peace was the least he could do. The experience had taught him the importance of understanding and compassion, even in the face of the inexplicable. Jenny Martinez sat at her desk, surrounded by notes and photographs from the case. Her article on the ghostly bride had brought her recognition, but it was the experience itself that had changed her. As a journalist, she had always been driven by a thirst for truth and a desire to uncover stories that mattered. This investigation had been the pinnacle of her career, but it had also been deeply personal. Jenny replayed the moments of the final confrontation in her mind. The fear she felt, the determination to help Emily, and the overwhelming sense of relief when the spirits of Emily and Richard finally found peace. It had been a journey into the unknown, filled with challenges and discoveries. She opened her laptop and began to write a follow-up article, this time focusing on the human aspect of the story. Jenny wanted to share the lessons she had learned. the importance of empathy, and the power of truth. She hoped her words would resonate with the readers and help them understand the deeper significance of the ghostly bride's tale. Community reaction. The town was abuzz with the news of the haunting's resolution. The local paper ran a front-page story detailing the investigation and the final confrontation, complete with Jenny's photographs and eyewitness accounts. The residents, who had lived in fear for so long, felt a collective sense of relief. The mayor organized a town meeting to address the community and commend Harris, Jenny, and their team for their efforts. The town hall was packed and the atmosphere was one of gratitude and hope. Harris and Jenny were called to the stage where they received a standing ovation. "Thank you, Detective Harris and Jenny Martinez, for your tireless work in solving this mystery and bringing peace to our town," the mayor said, his voice filled with emotion. "You have shown us the power of perseverance and the importance of understanding our past." Margaret Dawson, the local historian, also spoke, sharing her insights into the Collins family's history and the significance of their story. Emily and Richard's tale is a reminder that love and tragedy are deeply intertwined. By uncovering the truth, we have honored their memory and helped them find peace. The meeting concluded with a moment of silence for Emily and Richard, followed by a community gathering where people shared their own experiences and thoughts. The town had come together in a way it hadn't in years, united by a common story and a shared sense of healing. Lingering mysteries. Despite the resolution, there were still lingering questions and unexplained aspects of the case. Harris and Jenny met privately to discuss these mysteries and contemplate their next steps. "There's something that still bothers me," Harris said, leaning back in his chair. "Why did Emily's spirit become so restless now, after all these years? What triggered the recent hauntings?" Jenny nodded, considering the possibilities. "It could be the construction work near the old Collins estate," she suggested. "Disturbing the land might have unsettled her spirit, or perhaps the discovery of Richard's letter brought her unresolved emotions to the surface." Harris agreed. "It's possible. But there's also the matter of the other disappearances over the years. We only scratched the surface of those cases. We need to look deeper into them." They decided to continue their investigation, not just to uncover more about Emily and Richard, but to understand the broader phenomenon of the hauntings. The town had many stories and legends, and Harris and Jenny felt a responsibility to explore them. As they delved into old case files and local lore, they uncovered more tales of ghostly apparitions, unexplained phenomena, and tragic histories. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle, and Harris and Jenny were determined to piece it together. Epilogue. Months later, the town had settled back into its routine, but the story of the ghostly bride remained a poignant part of its history. Harris and Jenny continued their work, uncovering more mysteries and helping the community understand its past. One evening, as the sun set over the quiet town, Harris stood by the river where Emily and Richard's spirits had found peace. He thought about the journey they had undertaken, the challenges they had faced, and the lessons they had learned. It was a reminder that some mysteries were meant to be solved, not just for the sake of knowledge, but for the peace and understanding they brought. Jenny joined him, and they stood in silence, watching the river flow gently under the fading light. They knew their work was far from over, but they also knew that they had made a difference. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, the spirits of Emily and Richard watched over the town, finally at peace, their love story remembered, and honored by those who had helped them find their way.